My name is Tim Carter. This is a lesson for Cornell University. This is about creationism. One thing we're taught when we take, let's say, a course in hermeneutics, the science of interpretation, is to define your terms. So creationism, for example, creationism. Creationism, of course, an ism refers to the truth of creation. There's a phenomenon in creation. For example, people today have sacrificed or omitted something. So young earth, some people have invented this category of camp where they identify themselves, and others consider themselves old earthers. Now, an old earther will tell you how the age of the earth and then assume the age, let's say 4.5 billion, for example. And they'll assume that you go back a line that's 4.5 billion years long, a timeline. A linear line is the root word of linear. They talk as if time is linear, but everyone knows, scientists, especially scientists that has studied anything at all about physics and the reality of time. Time is not linear. Time is not linear. There's no line. Matter of fact, the greatest exasperation in eschatology is people assume time is line, so they'll take, for example, the book of Revelation and assume that it's written in a timeline. So they'll put this happens, then 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 this happens, and they do it. They form it in a line because we just think that way for some reason. I think it's because we're finite, we're fallen, but we're now a reproduction of the finite fallen Adam, and now we're just a reproduction. So we're just more steps removed. But the book of Revelation itself isn't written in a time. There's things taking place concurrently. There's things taking place simultaneously. There's things that are recapitulating. There are things that are iterated. There are things that are reiterated. So if you're trying to make the book of Revelation, for example, fit a timeline, such as the premise of all dispensationalism is always a timeline, and it's wishful thinking, and it's helpful. It works to learn and to lay things out. It's just not actually how it works. But for example, an old earth would like to say that I go back to a 4.5 billion year ago beginning, and then of the universe I go back 13.7 billion years, 13.7 billion year point in time. That's not even true according to the laws of physics study. So a young earther will say the earth was created 6,000 years ago, but then won't tell us the age of the earth. They omit the age. They're wanting us to assume that it's the same age as the time of its existence. Now, where the definition of creationism trumps both these incomplete, undeveloped, and both of them require a lesser than the Bible definition of creation. We can show it more simply in some people argue about literal days, and I don't know why that is, because according to the definition of creationism, the sixth day, literal day, Adam was created. Now, Adam didn't start as an infant and then become a toddler and then an adolescent and then a young adult, whatever. That didn't happen. Adam on the day he was created was a man. Adam was a full-grown man. Well, since everyone that teaches that the Bible is the sixth day is a literal day, the proof of this, first of all, creation itself demands that Adam was the result of a creative act of God, an act of God. So creationism, number one, refers to an act of God. More correctly state Godhead. The word Elohim is Godhead. Godhead. And if I get that wrong, just write to somebody who would care. But Elohim is the act of the Godhead, not a process. It is not a process. If you ever want to know what the word evolution means, it just is another way of saying a process. Some people say an evolutionary process. It's redundant. So, creationism is an act of God, not a process. So, since all creationists teach that on the sixth day Adam was created. So here we have Genesis 1:26. Adam is created. 1:27, the Adam who was alone, and it was not a good thing that he was alone. He didn't have a feminine side that all he needed to do was get in touch with it. He was not androgynous, as multitudes of people have been misled to believe that. Genesis 1:27, he was conjoined. He was made male and female. Some people still remember marriage services where you would say, I now pronounce you man and wife, or husband and wife. We say, do you take this man? Do you take this woman? We'll say man and woman. The Bible has wedding service in it where he conjoined, made them male and female. And here in the next verse, he told them to replenish the earth. So here we go. A man created here, a man conjoined to his wife, and they were told, as the people they were, the adults they were, to go out and populate the earth. So it's an act of God, one day, and a grown man. So one day and a grown man. Let me go ahead and erase this. So now we have an act of God, and an act of God, since it's not a process, we have one day, literal, normal day. So if we're talking about daylight, daytime, we're talking about 12 hours, daytime, and 12 hours, nighttime. So here we have Adam was, if he's created in the daytime, there's 12 hours, and yet he was fully grown. So I'm just going to say 30 years because I love listening to creationists talk about how old was Adam. And people will just, you can start your class and people will start saying, my grandpa used to say he thought he was the same age as Jesus when he died. And someone else said, well, my great uncle, the preacher, used to say he believed he was 21. And someone might say, my daddy used to teach me he was the age of Jesus when he began his ministry. But not a one of them will even consider how comfortable we are with the phenomenon of creation, that in one day, a literal grown person. So we're looking at one day is like 30 years. There we go. So now what do we call one day is like 30 years? Well, there's websites, there's scientific journals. There's a general science journal, and it's an article written, Does the Bible Show Einstein's Concepts of Relativity? There's another website, journals out there, academic articles. This one says The Theory of Relativity and God, and it's written in 2017. A very impressive website if you'd like to go there, if you want to. And it says, almost 1900 years ago, or 1800 years ago, before Einstein, Apostle Peter wrote that a day is like 1,000 years. Well, everyone so far believes creation was an act of the Godhead. Genesis 1:26 said in one day, 12 hours or 24 hours and and no one would care if you discuss that, and no one cares if no one says shame on you for thinking he was 21, which, you know, that can be determined, and we'll make a video about that using what we know about relativity. So now we have an act of God, a relative act. A relative act. Now everyone teaches this. All Christians that read the Bible literally teach this. Now, I'm not saying Christians who don't understand that the Bible can be demonstrated literally read, and that it all works fine, the arithmetic works, so you can check your own math. I'm not saying they're not a Christian or that they didn't believe Jesus and they have not believed the gospel. I'm just saying that sometimes we can be misled because we don't know that we could have read the Bible literally. So at this point, it's an act of God. We know it's relativity. It's a relativity is the manner of the act of God in the manner of affirmation. He did it in a relative way, so it was one day to 30 years. So in one day he did 30 years worth of creation. His act produced a 30-year-old mature man, grown man. So he's a man. So by all definitions so far, creationism is an act of God. The act is always relative, meaning, and I'll just make a note here, meaning that time or duration of existence never equals the age of the creation, or creature in this case, the creature. So creation or creature. So Adam was older than the time of his existence. That's relativity, demonstrated, proven irrefutably. Journals of science talk about relativity in the Bible. That is, it's referenced one day to 1,000. They talk about Einstein. You can look all this up. It's just remarkable today that young Earth won't teach how old the Earth is. Old Earth won't tell us when it was created, because if they say it was created just thousands of years ago, but it is aged in ratio according to relativity, which is absolutely irrefutably demonstrated in the Bible, then it doesn't really suit their argument. For example, a guy named Bill Nye would not have bode well in a debate with a man named Ken Ham if he had just said, yes, it's true, we all know from probably junior high level science classes that the Earth only had to come into existence thousands of years ago to, according to relativity, one day to 1,000 years to have aged to 4.5 billion, because how would he sold his book? How would he have generated all that division and hate? If Ken Ham had said, yes, as a young earther, we know that Adam was created in the sixth day, literal on that day, and that we teach adamantly and unashamedly and uninhibitedly and without reservation that Adam was a man that day. So he could have been 21, 30 years old, fully formed, fully developed, fully invested, all the work necessary for this marvelous physiology and this marvelous work of God to make that man like that. So nothing created, the time of its existence will never equal the age that it is. So now we still are working on our definition of creationism, and we're learning now that when we talk of the earth, this is talking about act of God, relativity, and one day to 30 years. And enjoy this, because I've never in all of my research and deliberately questioning and introducing the question to classes, to colleagues, online, social media, at state meetings, national meetings, I'll ask people, I said, how old do you think Adam was? Oh, you know, and then they're just so comfortably, because creationists haven't forgotten everything. Just because of the young or old false dilemma that's been juxtaposed artificially, and all this flummox has been incited and it's catalyzed all this vitriol, it doesn't mean that creationists have forgotten everything. And it gives you hope and encouragement when you can still talk to creationists who say, yeah, I think Adam was I think he was 40 years old. Okay, good job. And they'll tell you about their old wives' tales and things they figured out, you know, and people will say, I remember hearing about that. And yeah, so creationists, we haven't forgotten the doctrine of creationism. We haven't forgotten the definition of it. So when it comes to the earth, let's say here 2.5, the earth, and one day, 1,000 years. This is demonstrable, as we've learned, 12,500 times 360 days, which is how many days are in a year, equals 4.5 million days times 1,000 years equals 4.5 billion years of age. Now, that's no more a problem than 1 day to 30 for an individual man. So, the definition of creationism, which is absolute, irrefutable, it's why in Genesis 1:1, for example, Genesis 1:1, God instantly and then spoken, instant and spoken creation. Infinite power, did not have any time against which to work or in which necessary. There was no time in beginning. In time is in the day phrase is in Genesis 2:4, referring to the 6 days of creation where God was literally preparing the earth for Adam. So instant and spoken creation. Genesis 1:2, you don't have to throw anything away. You don't have to say there's a conflict. And Genesis 1:2 says the earth then came to be, or was, and then it says formless, without form, formless, and void or uninhabited. So vain or without form and void. Void. So whether you say was, you still have to answer when did it come to be like that, because come to be is not the verb in Genesis 1:1, it's bara. So saying that it was doesn't eliminate the when did it become that way. You'll have to answer become. It's not a problem though. It's just that when you define creationism as an act of God, that will always be in relative expression. That is, nothing created by the Creator. Now this can be proven by people that don't even believe the gospel. This can be proven by people that don't even believe the Bible. A person can take the Bible, an agnostic, an atheist, and a Christian, and they can all sit down in a room and they can all say, I noticed that you're saying this day is literal. Okay, we'll just say it's literal. Why would an atheist care? He doesn't believe the Bible anyway. Why would an agnostic care? Because he'll say, well, I don't know if it's literal or not. And why would a Christian care? Well, a Christian could care because they could then demonstrate that Adam, in the phenomenon of creation, is that he was a man the day God made him. He was a man from day one. He wasn't in his first trimester, his second trimester, his third trimester, and then born in infancy. He didn't go through toddler stage, adolescence, young adulthood. He didn't have any of that. He was man the first day. Well, if those who insist, as all Christians most Christians insist that the days are literal, well then the only way the day could be literal is if creation is according to relativity. And it is. So here there's no conflict. It's all demonstrable. It's all proven out. There's no conflict with the rationale here. There's no conflict with instant and spoken creation. This is a rationale for why the earth, what happened. This word come to be means happened. What, when and how and what caused formless and void to happen. Bara didn't do that. Haya did that. And Hayatha, Cal perfect third feminine singular, is the word for it. Earth is feminine, it's singular. So those of us who want to believe everything in the Bible can keep our instant and spoken creation, which is impossible for the infinite God. Infinity is demonstrated in instant and spoken creation. In the beginning was the Word. He predated time. Time is a relative reality. It's not something you can place in a can, and if it wasn't for relativity, time wouldn't be possible. Verse 14, I believe it's called, people talk about the measure of referential movement. Well, it means we just have a point of reference. Without it, we can't measure. There's nothing to measure. And without a reference, and without movement with a reference point, like, for example, the principle upon which a sundial was based, the shade and the shadow and its movement, people could then synchronize a sundial with the shade and the shadow being cast and moved. So it's all referential movement. But the definition of creationism, when we return to the original definition that all Christians have asserted throughout centuries and science has used, Einstein didn't make up relativity. He was from a Jewish background. He knew the Hebrew Bible. He knew of the invariance of light. So when he said light is constant, sure, he knew the concept and then proved it out in his observations, empirical observations. When he talked about relativity, he knew that and learned that concept, and was among, well, the Jewish people knew the concept. It was in their Bible. Well, then he went and worked out the formulas of how that could be applied and how that would prove certain things that, according to the theories that people would construct. But really, there is no question about relativity in the Bible, but there is a question about the definition of creation. So if you're an old earther, be careful, because there's a lot of Christians who know time isn't linear. If you're a young earther, be careful, because there's a lot of Christians that know the Bible teaches relativity. It's just you probably don't have to be too careful to run into people who actually include all the Bible, because historical holistic hermeneutics invites all the Bible into the equation and doesn't reject 360 days, which is taught by the Bible, doesn't reject 1 day as 1,000 years, which is taught in the Bible, and doesn't even blush. We don't even blush when we can see how self-evident this expression is, especially when you take the nighttime out and you're down to 6,250, which is approximately 6,000 years. So before you ridicule the old earther, be careful and know that first, it's not a Christian expression to ridicule, berate, belittle. Paul said the person that eats vegetation and just vegetation only, he's a weak brother. So let's not diminish him. Today we think someone on a disciplined dietary regimen is a strong person, but he was speaking of people who were afraid to eat things that might have been offered to an idol, and he was saying, let us not ridicule that person. So some people are afraid. They're afraid, oh, I don't want to talk about science. I've been taught science is evil, science is bad. They don't know that theology produced science. They don't know theologians produced calculus, physics, chemistry. Even William James of Harvard University, theologian, produced a field of psychology. The first professor or first president of Harvard University was a Baptist. They don't know that, so they are afraid and they are alarmed. And people are saying, "Oh, I'm afraid people that aren't teaching old earth, they're leading people astray, and they're going to shipwreck people's faith." And all these people are expressing their fears. It's better to take that energy and invest it into study to show yourself approved, a workman that needs not to be ashamed, and you can rightly divide the word of truth. And then you can see that the first thing to do is say, what are we talking about in creation? Act of God, not a process. We're talking about 1 day to 30 years, talking about Adam, which everyone teaches that, and you can get anyone involved in that conversation, unless they reject a literal day. And then you go to the earth, 1 day is 1,000 years, and you see that that works out. And I know people dismiss the Bible as coincidence, just like people dismiss the book of Daniel, which teaches to the very day the Messiah was cut off, and people dismiss the sign of Jonah, 3 days in the whale. They say the whale didn't exist, or the great fish, and how did he live, and what happened to him. And well, we know that phenomenon is factual, especially once we know that the thesis sentence of the Bible is that in beginning God, in beginning, not in time, in beginning God created the heaven, collective, and the earth, so space and matter were instantly created and spoken. Even recently, a young man was teaching, and he was advocating himself as a young earther. But in the conversation, he was quoting Genesis 1:1. And remember, creationism hasn't been lost, even though people walk away from it and abandon it. But it hadn't been completely forgotten, because while he was waxing eloquent, he said, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth." And he said he spoke, and it was instantly. And then he went on and realized what he had said. But in that moment of clarity, and in that moment of showing the greatness of God and his infinity, that this infinite God with infinite power, all might, hold sway over all things, did not exert himself to speak it all instantly into existence. And what he created was not formless, it was not deformed, it was not empty. We have all we need to know that it was instantly and spoken and perfectly created, and it was without anything. A lot of people almost prefer a deformed God to have a perfect earth, and we have a perfect God with an earth that came to be deformed, and yet everything works out perfectly. So much so that we can go to the Bible in a prophetic book like Daniel and take a few numbers and show the very day that Jesus was crucified. So much so is that so powerfully and easily demonstrated that people have actually amended their own doctrines by taking sections of Daniel out, so that their own people in Judaism, for example, are not taught to read their own Bible, their own Old Testament, because the precision of the very day of the cutoff of the Messiah was actually the very day Jesus was killed, and that's not even third grade level arithmetic. So the Bible doesn't, I guess people who've gone into Kabbalah and numerology and astrology aren't interested in these numbers, but those of us who take the Bible literally, read it literally, read the book of Daniel literally, accept literal days of Jonah in the whale, just as Jesus was in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, and those of us who accept the 6 days are literal, it's very much demonstrable. And those of us who accept the Bible that in beginning was not in time, that's Genesis 2:4, in the day, singular, and then Exodus refers to the 6 days. That's what God did inside of time, and everything else is self-evident. So really the definition of creationism, when you define that, then you won't find adequate any longer the expression of young earth or the expression old earth. You won't find the conflict over gap or no gap, because you go to Genesis 1:1 first, an established instant and spoken creation, which is irrefutable. And I wouldn't know the motivation or the incentive of someone unless they think instant and spoken is too young of an earth. So I never thought about too young earthers. So I guess we will be accused of being a too young earther, T-double-O. So I'm too young earther, which that'd be a contradiction. And we believe instant and spoken creation, and we still teach the literal 6 days, and we still teach the earth was not without form, that it was not deformed, it was not void, and all those other horrible ways. And you can make this better if you want to. It doesn't matter. You still have to answer. Well, you don't have to answer me. I don't require answers from anyone. I'm a producer, not a consumer. I am a positor, not an inquisitor. Posit outwardly, that's the verb from positive, the adjective. So I'd rather posit outwardly. So here's a definition of creationism, and yes, young earth and old earth, fallible constructs are fallible because the elements omitted, even deliberately omitted because of source bias and source avoidance, prevents a person from the reality that the relativity in relationship to Adam, the phenomenon of Adam's creation, betrays the young and old earth argument. So thank God that we have an absolute answer and absolute truth, just as surely as we can take the prophecy in Daniel and come to the very absolute day Jesus was cut off. We can take these simple numbers but profound teaching, act of God, relativity, and we can demonstrate it with absolute accuracy. So you have a blessed day and enjoy the definition of creationism, and avoid anything that would cause you to have to reduce and modify or reduce the definition to something less to fit some argument that's fallible. So have a blessed